Leslie Francis. I'm a faculty member here at the law school, and I am just delighted to welcome you all back. Our first speaker in this session is Dr. Paine, who will be speaking, Dr. Robert Paine, the John M. Huntsman Presidential Chair and Professor of Internal Medicine, the Chief of the Division of Respiratory, Critical Care, and Occupational Pulmonary Medicine here at the University of Utah. Dr. Paine will be speaking to us on the consequences of a shrinking Great Salt Lake for human health. Dr. Paine.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. This is a wonderful session, and I'm looking forward to spending a few minutes with you now. Kevin Parry gave a beautiful introduction this morning, talking about the dust and where it comes from, why we have it, and introduced some of the issues around the health effects. And I'm going to drill a little bit deeper here. I hope you all believe that particulate air pollution is bad for health. If you don't, I'll talk to you about that a little later, and we can go into it a little deeper. But some of the things we need to think about a little more as we look at the specific issues that will arise from the drying lake bed is issues as to why the size of particles matter. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between short-term effects and long-term effects and how the lake dust may change those. And we're also going to talk about the nature of the particles. Dr. Parry introduced the word arsenic this morning, and we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more as well. I'm going to try to hit a nice balance between some of the science and a few numbers, but at the same time keep it high level in terms of the things people can take home as the important messages. You may have seen this picture before. It's useful to have some sense of what the size of particles is all about. And we talk about PM10 or PM2.5, and those numbers give you the aerodynamic diameter, how big the particle is. And this slide's helpful because it gives you a sense of, oh, there's a human hair, and there's some, at 90 microns is fine beach sand. The PM10 is dust that you might see, particularly around your house, mold, pollen. And then PM2.5 is these very tiny particles that you can't see without a microscope, although when they all get together, you may have trouble seeing the ochres. Now, why have we picked out PM2.5 as something that's important? Because we know air pollution has all sorts of size particles, but we measure PM10 and PM2.5, and the Environmental Protection Agency has set standards for these because of their potential for getting into the lungs and the health effects. So I'm going to teach you a little bit of lung anatomy and physiology here. So as we talk about, when you breathe in, you breathe through your mouth and your nose, and you get to your windpipe. That's, this is a big hose, but then it branches and branches and branches. And from the nose to get to the whole working part of the lung involves, 23 generations of branching. Lots and lots of separations. And these tubes get smaller and smaller. And for those of you who are used to small rivers that run, or who have dealt with forced hot air heating in your home, it's an air conditioning, or sometimes with plumbing, you know that when something is flowing through a tube and then it hits a branch point, anything that's carried in the fluid deposits at that branch point. And the way this is set up is larger particles fall out as they come in. So your nose screens a lot of things. Your upper airway screens things. The PM10, as was mentioned this morning, gets out into some of the smaller airways. And the really small particles get all the way out to the working part of the lung. Okay. Now that working part of the lung, I like to put this slide up. It's a tennis court. And the surface area of the tennis court is equivalent to the surface area of the adult male lung. It's about 100 square meters. It's our largest site of interaction with the outside world. And what happens is, as we take air in and it moves out, we get to a point where air and blood are very, very close together. In fact, you need a very powerful microscope to even see that there's a barrier. And that means that anything carried in the air that's of an appropriate size, 2.5 microns, and gets down there has access to the blood, and through that can affect health in all the other organs. And over time, with many studies, we know that air pollution, particularly particulate air pollution, PM2.5, impacts many, many organs. It impacts the lungs, of course, because that's where the particles go in the first place. It impacts the brain, and people have strokes. It impacts the circulatory system, causing high blood pressure. It can worsen diabetes. And in pregnant women, it can cause premature births and low birth weight infants. So it has a huge array of health effects. Now, there are important differences in terms of the time frame of particulate matter exposure. And I'm going to distinguish between short-term and long-term. And for short-term, we'll talk about hours to days. And we actually, if you listen to the weather person at night, they'll be talking about what our numbers are. And the numbers they usually give us is the 24-hour average. And the Environmental Protection Agency has set a level, and I'll show you these. No, you don't need, not trying to remember these numbers, but come back and talk about the level where they get really excited is above about 35 micrograms per cubic meter. So a cubic meter of air, it's a large amount. And if you've got 35 micrograms of PM2.5, then you are in violation of EPA standards, and we have a red air day. For longer term exposure, they average things over the course of a year. And this could be used to then look and see how somebody's exposure has been over many years. And we'll use that in some of the medical data. And the EPA has a threshold there of about 12 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, in Utah, in the Salt Lake Valley, we're very used to inversions in the winter, to these cold pool events. And as you know, we end up with a situation with a high pressure area, snow on the ground, cold air, and everything that's emitted into the valley builds up, and over time we reach a high level of pollution. And I've got my 35 is my level there, and you can see we go up and it's high, and then a storm comes and clears it out, builds up again, another storm, and so on and so forth. So this is the sort of thing we're accustomed to. And there's a lot of data on the health effects of these short-term events. We know there's data all over the world, but data actually from Utah, we know that the risk of heart attack goes up after 1 to 3 days of increased particulate matter. And in fact, it goes up by about 4% for every 10 microgram per cubic meter elevation. Well, in that graph I just showed you, we know that we went from a level of about 10 up to 35, 40, 50. So you're getting a real multiplicative effect. We also know you get increased stroke risk of about that same magnitude. Now, these numbers, these are small changes at the level of sort of an individual, so that an individual emergency room doctor or an individual hospital won't say, oh, I saw a whole lot more problems with heart attacks and strokes. But when we do the statistics and look at what's happened across the whole valley, we see that this was very much a real effect. We also see increased respiratory events with asthma attacks. People who have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD will have worsenings requiring changes in their medication, often ER visits or hospitalizations. And we know that from other studies from Utah, from Ben Horn and colleagues down at Intermountain, that if you look at how many kids show up in the ER with lower respiratory tract complaints, bronchitis, pneumonia, and those things, those all go up short-term in response to higher levels of particulate pollution. We also know, looking at pneumonia, Cheryl Perozzi, one of my colleagues at the university, did a nice study showing that that older individuals above age 65 are more likely to have pneumonia, requiring hospitalization, and even have increased rates of death after short periods of elevated particulate matter. Now, to put a few more numbers on that, this is, again, a sort of classic winter period with inversions, and the air quality gets worse. And we know that if you get an increase of 20 micrograms per cubic meter, that's, again, within the range of what it's actually low for an inversion, that people over 65 will be 2.5 times more likely to have pneumonia, about 2.5 times more likely to have severe pneumonia, and 3 times more likely to die in the hospital with pneumonia. I'm going to show you another experiment that actually is kind of a fun one to think about. This was done in London, and they took some people who had mild asthma. They used inhalers, but fully functional, and said, okay, go for a walk. You're going to go for a walk for 2 hours, and then we're going to check how your lungs work. But we're going to do your walk in 2 different places. We're going to do a walk on Oxford Street, where there's buses and diesel fumes, lots of pollution, or you can go to Hyde Park, where it's nice and tranquil and the air is better. In fact, the kind of numbers they get, again, the PM 2.5 levels wouldn't really raise a flag here. They're up in the upper limits of acceptable. And in Hyde Park, they're better. They're about 12. And what they did is they did a pulmonary test where you have a person take a breath in and blow out as hard as you can. And we know if you have asthma and your airway's narrow, you can't blow out as fast and you can't blow as much out. So we measure how much you blow out in 1 second. And if that goes down, we know that your asthma is causing you problems. So this is looking at that value, that change in how much they can blow out in 1 second. And when they walked in Hyde Park, not much change, everything was fine. When they walked on Oxford Street, it drops. And I guess that's not a surprise, but they took a 2-hour walk. And the next day, 22 hours later, they were still reduced. So we know this caused lots of inflammation, it made their asthma worse. It has a longer term effect than you might expect from the short exposure. Now, talked about heart attacks and strokes and a bunch of these respiratory things. But in some of the large epidemiologic studies, we say, okay, what happens if we just look across cities, what's happening to mortality rate? Is air pollution on a short term, not horrible air pollution, but just, modest changes, is that changing mortality rates? And this is a study that looked at over 600 cities across 24 countries, and they looked over 2 days, so really quite short term, and they looked at all-cause mortality. And as you can see, the worse the pollution, the higher the mortality. But the important thing here is there is no safe level of pollution, that it has effects even down at the bottom. And also, this curve actually gets steeper and steeper as it goes to the bottom, down here. So in that red box, the pollution levels are actually quite low. We would be saying it's an okay day here, and it's the steepest part of the curve. So a small change in pollution there actually has a bigger change in the mortality than it does up in areas where in cities where the pollution is much higher. So it makes a difference what's happening even with small changes. Yeah, and there is no level of pollution that's safe. So let's think about the lake bed and the dust that Dr. Parry was talking about this morning. So we'll see increased day-to-day particulate exposure, an increased number of days of higher levels of PM10 and PM2.5. And those are going to be associated if, again, I'm not the one to tell you how much dust we'll have or what the levels will be, but if the projections are right for worsening air quality, we're going to have increased cardiovascular events, we'll have increased respiratory events, and we'll have increased overall mortality. And I want to emphasize that by worsening our air quality, by having more days like that, we'll see these health effects even in the absence of the extreme events where you can't see across the valley. So that's short term. I want to move now to long-term effects. And this is data from DAQ, the Division of Air Quality. And, you know, on the news we spend all our time talking about inversions, wildfires, I'll mention those in a minute, and short-term things, because Utah actually does okay in terms of our long-term average. All those lines are from all the different monitoring stations we have. That orange line, orange dotted line, is the current standard of 12 micrograms per cubic meter, and we're pretty much okay. Everything looks good, and you can also see we're better than we've been over a number of years. That's great. We know that small changes in annual average can have important health effects. I'm going to circle back to what the dust is going to do for that, but as we think about it, we know from lots of large studies that if the community is experiencing higher average PM2.5, you're going to have more heart attacks, more overall mortality, you're going to have worse lung disease. We also know that over the last 10 years or so, it's been recognized that air pollution, particulate air pollution in general, not talking about arsenic, but just particulate pollution overall, is actually viewed as the second leading cause of lung cancer after cigarette smoke. So it's, you know, the particulate matter is a big deal here. And this is a study. I keep bringing it back because I want to always bring some data in, so you know this isn't just my opinion. And this looks at mortality, and this was assessed in 2000. And they said, let's look at what people were exposed to back between 1979 and 83, or between 1999 and 2000. So longer ago, more recent. And if their air quality is worse, if the average particulate pollution is higher, what happens? And this is percent change in mortality. And we know that overall mortality is worse. In particular, the cardiopulmonary mortality is worse. Heart attacks, that's ischemic heart disease, are up by 13 and 15%. Cancer's up, and everything else actually does okay because all those things are so bad. So we're talking about discrete big events, heart attacks, hospital admissions, but air pollution actually has other kinds of impacts. This is a study, the Nurses' Health Study is a wonderful study where a number of nurses were enrolled in a cohort and followed over many years and told us about where they lived, and we were able to figure out their environmental exposure, their diets. It's been a tremendous source of information. And this part of it, they took 19,000 women who were aged 70 to 81, and they were able to track where they'd lived and what their average exposure to PM2.5 had been. And then they did some detailed cognitive testing and said, okay, you're getting older, let's look at how you're thinking. And what they found is that there's a decline in cognitive function, not surprising, but that when they looked at the exposure to particulate pollution they'd had, basically an average of 10 micrograms per cubic meter higher levels of particulate matter over the years accelerated their cognitive aging by about 2 years. So that we are not, that when we are seeing higher average levels, we're actually speeding aging of the brain. And then at the other extreme, we can talk about pregnancy and newborns. And it's well known that exposure to particulate air pollution gives you increased odds of premature birth, increased odds of low birth weight babies, even at full term. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what the key parts of pregnancy are for this, but it looks like it has effects on at least the first trimester, during the first trimester and the third trimester. So long-term pollution, implications of the dry and safe Great Salt Lake for long-term pollution are very important. We know that despite the focus on short-term effects, we need to be thinking more about these long-term issues. And Great Salt Lake dust is tied to the winds. And Kevin did a great job pointing out that the winds mainly are in spring and fall, right? We have our inversions in the winter, we have wildfires in the summer, and now we have spring and fall where we're going to have increased problem with pollution. And so adding lake bed dust pollution to our wintertime events is going to increase the average annual level of PM 2.5. And that increased average level is going to lead to increased mortality and increased burden of illness. My third point I want to talk about is the nature of particles. This, I needed a transition slide, so this is my transition slide. Turns out that PM 2.5 differs depending on where you live. And these funny little circular graphs show what goes into the particles. And you can see sometimes it's more sulfate, sometimes it's more carbon, organic carbon. There is some nitrate in there, except in Salt Lake City, where it's tremendously nitrate. We're still trying to understand the implications of, nitrate versus sulfate and things. We know all particulate pollution is bad, but trying to understand which is worse. We also know that in the Salt Lake Valley, it's a little complicated because there's stuff that's emitted as particles, but there's also other chemicals that are emitted from all our usual sources of pollution. And those things all get together in an enormous black box in the atmosphere. And when we've got cold conditions, lots of sunlight, all the things that happen during our inversions, you end up actually cooking an evil soup and making new particulate matter. And during the peak of an inversion, about 2/3 of the particles are these ones that were generated in the atmosphere. Now, they're generated from things we emitted. This is not naturally occurring stuff, but they're different than the others. And there's evidence that for heart disease, the secondary particles may be worse than the primary particles. So we're trying to understand how these differences change things. Now, similarly, we get wildfires. And the Salt Lake Tribune, how bad is this year's wildfire season? Actually not that bad, so long as you're not trying to breathe. And we know that wildfire smoke differs from the usual stuff that's emitted along I-15, and that it's got all sorts of terrible stuff in it. There's, beyond carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides, it's got irritants, it's got known carcinogens of multiple sorts. It's got dioxin, a terrible poison, and I don't have a slide for it, but we know that wildfire smoke causes significant, short-term exposure to wildfire smoke causes the same problems, but perhaps worse than the things we get from our urban emissions. So it's a bad actor, and some differences in how much heart disease, how much lung disease, things like that. So what about dust from dried lake beds? And just as we think about it, there are three we might want to think about. We mentioned, is it Owen Lake or Lake Owen? I see it both ways, but you're going to hear about it tomorrow, so I'm not actually going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan. And the Aral Sea, similar to the Great Salt Lake, went from, 1989 to 2004. It pretty much has been disappearing as we move towards 2014. And you say, yes, there's a lot of dust, very similar to what we've got. Now, it's interesting, this is in a heavy agricultural area, and over the years, they'd been pouring fertilizer and pesticides onto the fields that then ran into this lake bed, and as the lake bed into the lake, and as the lake dried, got left in the lake bed, and then aerosolized. And they found increased levels of the pesticides and fertilizers in nearby residents. They've got increased rates of respiratory disease, of lung cancer, and if they look at kids' lung function, kids growing up in the area have poorer lung function. What about arsenic? So, and I'm going to focus on arsenic. I know there are other heavy metals there, and we'll figure out more, but arsenic certainly gets a lot of attention and is the easiest to talk about. And the questions of how toxic is it? How toxic is it, and does it matter how you're exposed to it? So this is an EPA slide. So we usually think about arsenic as something that's ingested. It gets into groundwater, it gets into food, it gets in and it causes cancer, it causes all those things in the middle. And we want to decrease exposure by cleaning up the groundwater and everything else. But you can actually be exposed to it by inhalation. We don't understand it nearly as well. The studies are mainly occupational exposures from mining and smelting. The Anaconda smelter in Montana has been a big source of information. There are a few studies, not just of workers, but of people living by there, and this is a case where there's no animal data that's useful. And there's some suggestion from all this that arsenic's an irritant. If it gets, if you breathe it in, you're going to cough, have bronchitis, and it may advance your COPD. But there's very compelling evidence that it causes cancer, particularly the respiratory tract and lung cancer. And as Dr. Parry mentioned this morning, the EPA has a standard, and they have a residential standard, and they have an industrial standard. And the dust in the Great Salt Lake, when you look at the lake bed dried powder, it actually exceeds the industrial standard by a good bit. How much will come into the air that we breathe? We're still trying to figure that part out. So, my take-home points concerning the health effects of a shrinking Great Salt Lake. I think that if we have dust that's aerosolized as we anticipate, all the things that you've been hearing about this morning, that dust is going to contribute to increased short-term particulate matter exposure, and that's going to have immediate health effects in terms of heart attacks, strokes, pneumonia, asthma. I think it's very important that it's going to contribute to long-term average particulate matter exposure, and that's going to reverse some of the recent hard-fought gains in our air quality and lead to worsening health. And yeah, arsenic is scary, and arsenic in the lake dust has the potential to lead to increased rates of lung cancer in the Salt Lake Valley. So with that, I'll stop. The air's supposed to look like that. Hopefully we can have it that way most of the time. And if there's time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, we actually thank you so much. We actually have about 10 minutes for questions, which is great. So the one that's gotten a lot of thumbs up is, what are your recommendations for indoor air quality treatment systems? HVAC companies recommend UV and hydrogen peroxide induct purifiers. Do these do anything about PM 2.5?
So one of the big things we spend a lot of time thinking about is the issues related to indoor air quality. So all those statistics about ambient air, most people aren't spending their time outside. Most people spend most of their time inside, but we still know there are these close associations. In general, your indoor air is going to be, in most instances, not always, your indoor air is going to be better than the outdoor air. Even if you have just kind of a normal home and doing nothing special. You certainly should worry about having a good filter on your forced hot air and your air conditioning, changing those filters out, things like that. I think I like the concept of HEPA filters and things like that, but I think if for people who don't have underlying respiratory problems, we're still a little early to know how big a bang you get for your buck there. So I like the idea, but I'm not totally, I haven't bought all the advertising from some of the HVAC companies.
Another question about how we protect ourselves from PM 2.5 and PM 10. Should we bring back face masks?
So the PM 2.5, you can get protection with a tight-fitting N95 mask. But at the hospital, every year, I have to go through mask fitting. And I have to know that the mask fits and nothing sneaks in. And oh, by the way, if you have more than 3 days growth of facial hair, they say it's never going to work, don't even try it. So, surgical masks, cloth masks won't do any good. The KN95s that I use, that many of us use, I think are potentially helpful. And during a bad inversion during the winter, I tell my patients to wear them. When we're looking at the difference between, these smaller differences, I'm not convinced we're going to solve that with a face mask. I think we'll solve that by raising the lake level and decreasing emissions.
So about the body's natural processes, do bodies naturally cleanse our lungs of particulate pollution over time, or do pollution intake rates just keep on outstripping our ability to detoxify what's happening?
The lungs really are very effective at cleaning things out. There's a whole system of, there's actually some surface mucus, not a very thin layer that particles land in. That mucus is actually carried up and eventually makes it up to where you may swallow it or spit it out. There are cells in the lungs that are responsible for sucking these things up and clearing them away. One of the particular problems with with arsenic is some of the forms of arsenic aren't readily dissolvable, and they go there and they don't clear out as well, and they hang around a long time, and that's maybe part of the reason arsenic causes the cancer that it does. So if they're overwhelmed, so if you look at a coal miner who's exposed to black dust day in, day out, eventually, yes, parts of their lungs look black when if you were to do a biopsy or something. But in general, we do a pretty good job, our lungs do a pretty good job of cleaning themselves.
Thank you. A hypochondriac wants to know whether to move within 5 years.
I will second Dr. Parry's comment this morning. Utah's a lovely place to live. If you look at life expectancy in Utah, it's actually higher than a lot of places around the country. It's just not as high as it could be if we had better air quality. So I tell people to, they should think about their own circumstance, but I wouldn't take this and say, I got to get out of here.
So this is a question about dust, and I'm not sure it's one for you, but I'll try it. Do we need to regulate possible RV use on the portions of the lake bed that will remain dry to minimize harmful dust in the air?
I'm going to defer to others on that, whether it would be certainly the RVs will stir up dust. Whether that's enough dust to change anything, I'll let others address.
This is going to be my question. As somebody who occasionally wants to pretend to jog, should people stop exercising?
It's actually a question I get a lot. And what I tell people is exercise is really good for you, and I'm strongly encourage exercise. When we have periods of poor air quality, whether it is wildfires, inversions, dust storms, that's not a good time to exercise outside. That's a good time to cross-train and do something indoors because the indoor air quality is going to be better. If it's an inversion, go up to higher elevation where you won't have as much. But don't expose yourself during these very high periods.
Yes, which raises one more question. I remember a number of years ago a study that looked at the admissions to hospitals across the valley elevation-wise, and they were much higher on the west side of the valley during inversions. Yeah. And I wonder whether we should all move up to Fort Douglas during the
Lots of things factor into that. Certainly, there's better air quality higher up. There's also some streams of air that come down some of the canyons that change things. But the social determinants of health in terms of race and ethnicity, economic status, also factors into that east side, west side divide. So yes, we should improve. There's more pollution on the west side, and we should try to improve the air quality there, but we need to do a lot more there as well.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Paine. Our second speaker in this session is Darren Parry, who's former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation and author of The Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History. He is going to speak to us on Indigenous perspective to climate and environment.
It's not lost on me that I'm in a room full of scientists. And I don't know if that's a good thing or bad. Centuries ago, the smoke from the wigwam and the fires from the council meetings rose from every village. The young listened to songs and tales of bygone years. They listened and learned so that one day they might be able to repeat the same. The mothers took time out to play with their children and taught them to love and appreciate the most simplest joys of nature. The aged sat down with only memories of hunting and killing, feasting and starving and worshiping. Braver men never lived than the red man. Truer men never walked this land. They shrank from no danger. They feared no hardship, because fear and danger and death were daily companions. They were taught to love each other and be united in all things. They dare not pluck a flower or twig or herb or fruit unless they ask permission from the Great Spirit. But little by little, the Indian is vanishing into a society that you call civilization. He's trying to forget the wrongs done to him. He's trying to forget that once his forefathers had stewardship over this great land, that their seat extended from the rising sun to the setting sun. He can only recall in memory of hunting the bison and the deer, that these creatures were put on this earth for his use by the Great Spirit. He can remember that Mother Earth was created to produce corn and plants. He must try and forget the day that the white men crossed the great blue waters and landed upon this land. He must remember that his forefathers were friends to these new people and not enemies. He must remember that they gave them a small seat. He must remember that his forefathers gave them corn and meat. He must forget, in return for his kindness, they were given poison. He must remember the strangers calling him brother, and remember that they only wanted a larger seat. They wanted the land. They came for the water. They came for the whole country. He can only recall with great sadness when the pony soldiers gave his people much-needed warm blankets that had been used by soldiers with smallpox, and thousands upon thousands of Indians died. They must try and forget the wrongs done to them. The Indians have been forced to leave their small home, leaving behind the ashes of their native hearth. No longer does that smoke curl around the wigwam. No longer does they stalk deer and buffalo. No longer do they creep upon the fowls. No longer are we going up and down the stream looking for fish. Now we are told that we must have a license. No longer is his chant heard at night. No longer is a loud wail heard at death. We must express ourselves in a different manner now. We must wear shoes upon our feet, feet that would rather roam in soft skins. We must cut our hair because that is the way of a civilized man. We must wear clothing even though our bodies cry for less clothing. We must eat food that makes our teeth soft. He is changing slowly. He is watching, though, and waiting to see the effects of civilization upon men. Will civilization make them stronger men or truer men? The Indian is moving with a slow step, moving with an uneasy step. But before long, we will catch the pace of the white man and move as fast as he does. But first of all, the Indians must erase deep resentments and painful recollections that are a distraction to him. Only in memory can he see the deserted villages and cast a glance upon his graves of his fathers and forefathers. He sheds no tears, utters no cries or groans. There is sadness in his heart that surpasses speech. But he is looking forward and going onward. But never for a moment will he forget that he is an Indian, a proud race, a race born with a spirit that cannot be enslaved. Although his looks may change, his thoughts will always be an Indian. Just over 100 years ago, the Colorado Commission got together and signed the Colorado River Compact at Bishop's Lodge, New Mexico. The commission included delegates from the 7 Colorado Basin states and was chaired by Herbert Hoover. Guess who wasn't there? More than 30 federally recognized Indian tribes that called the Great Basin home. You see, Manifest Destiny was never about land in the West. It's always been about water. Land without water in the West is useless. First in time, first in right, became the law of the land, unless you were Native American. What if they had been invited to the table? Would things be different today? Would the Colorado River and many other waterways, including the Great Salt Lake, be in the extreme crisis that they are in today if they had been co-managed by Indigenous people? I'm the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation. 160 years ago, near the Utah-Idaho border, some 700 members of my tribe were wintering as they had done for centuries. Hot springs along the Bear River provided a welcome place for them to catch their breath, catch up with family, but most importantly, heal. A half a mile to the east, Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, had the same bird's eye view on the morning of January 29th in 1863. Without so much as asking the Shoshones for any guilty party, the colonel and his men began to fire their rifles and sidearms at my people. My grandmother describes it as our people being slaughtered like wild rabbits. By early afternoon, more than 400 Shoshones were dead, 2/3 of those being women and children. Have you ever had a memory sneak out of your eye and roll down your cheek? I have that all the time when I think about the massacre of my people. In 2018, we were able to negotiate the purchase of 550 acres of that sacred burial ground. Those bodies are still there. This was only the beginning for us to tell our unique story from our perspective. But I didn't want to stop at just owning the land. My first visit was to Utah State University, where I met with professors in the College of Natural Resources. I told them I had a goal of restoring that massacre site to what it would have looked like in 1863, using my grandmother's plant diary as a guide. I wanted to know if it was feasible, and I knew that I didn't possess the skill set necessary to make that decision. Our first interaction more than 4 years ago has brought us where we are today. We have developed partnerships with not only Utah State, but the University of Utah and many others. This will be a living, learning classroom for decades to come. It requires more than us removing invasive species and plants and planting new seeds. It involves restoring the watershed, which will require buy-in from landowners upstream. How are they going to feel about the reintroduction of the beaver in their ecosystem? How will they feel about changing decades-old farming practices when we create riparian buffer zones? We will be moving Beaver Creek back into its original channel using our water rights with the goal of reintroducing the Bonneville cutthroat trout. We will be putting significantly more water back into the Bear River, which will, we hope, make it to the lake. But this isn't a project that we can do alone. But what I've decided over my time overseeing this project is healing begins when you bring people together. What we're doing at Bear River will not only symbolically, but literally have a long-lasting impact on not only the Bear River, but on the Great Salt Lake and many other waterways in Utah. I'm thankful for the teachings of my people. Mountains are sacred. They carry within them the substance needed for life, from the water running down into the streams in our valleys to the plants that are used as food and medicine. My grandmother would tell me, slow down, listen, and ponder the lessons that are being taught. There's great natural order to the universe of which man is a part. We have been endowed with the ability to observe, learn, and imitate this order. It's a relationship of giving and taking. It's what I call reciprocity. I believe that ancient tribal cultures have important lessons to teach the rest of the world about how all things are connected, and the fact that our very existence is dependent upon the natural world that we seem to be destroying. Our environment and climate are changing. Native people have always possessed a profound kinship with nature. Pre-Columbus America was still our first Eden. Native people were transparent in this ecosphere. All of our decisions considered the effects of our actions on generations to come. We don't live in that space anymore, but we've got to start for our children, our grandchildren, and those generations yet unborn. When Columbus and others first discovered this country, and I use that term lightly, it bore marks of thousands of years of human habitation. As they moved inland, they continued to encounter settlements and recently abandoned agricultural landscapes. Assisted by Indian guides and subsisting on native food the pioneers at the head of those Euro-American advances, followed the signposts of cleared fields and orchards that have recorded the long experience of Native Americans in selecting good soils and managing their local ecologies. But Europeans began to alter that landscape in ways that had never been altered before. Yet in spite of all of this, my people have survived and continued, in some cases, to thrive. Our ability to adapt to a changing landscape has allowed us to still be here. I want you to know that our languages are strong. Ceremonies that we've conducted since the beginning of time are still being held. Our governments are surviving. And most importantly, we continue to exist as distinct groups, as sovereign nations, in the midst of the most powerful country in the world. We've had a history that has contributed significantly to not just the U.S., but to the world. I think there's not that many Native Americans in the world today, and we tend to get overlooked in many ways. And when we're not overlooked, sometimes we tend to be misrepresented. History on occasion has reduced my people to one-dimensional characters, important only in the sense that we taught the Pilgrims to grow corn. We long to be heard and recognized. Our voices have been quiet for a long time, and in some cases we're still searching for that identity. But I believe we have much to contribute. We know that the earth and all of its creations came into being by the Great Spirit as the creator and designer. The Great Spirit put into place finely tuned systems, parameters, and cycles that will continue to sustain life if we don't screw it up. We were given careful instructions to take care of it. We were caretakers and not owners. And that's a distinction that is not understood in the world today. The lands are not something that we can buy. They're a gift. The lands have always belonged to the Creator and the water. We have been instructed to not overuse either one of them and to allow them to rest at certain times. The Creator expects us to sustainably manage the resources that we have because we have been given and instructed to leave an inheritance for those yet to come. The lands the colonizers first put their eyes on was not untouched or wild, as some have recorded, but rather the result of a broad range of indigenous land management techniques. In the late 1800s, John Muir commented that the Indians walked softly and hurt the landscape hardly more than a bird or squirrel. And as a result, the land that the Europeans first arrived to was rich and fertile, organized and well-tended. We never struggled against nature. We always worked within a set bounds and out of a spirit of respect. We took no more than we could use and used all that we could from what we took, always making sure we put the time and effort back into the land so that she would continue to produce year after year. We have believed, as you should, that the Great Spirit put everything on this earth for our survival. Nature needs to be tended and lovingly maintained. The natural resources on this earth will continue to produce year after year, but only when our steps are light and our hearts are right. But things have changed, sadly. How do we reconcile the past, where Western values teach us that we all have individual rights, that the land and water is there for extraction, development, and depletion, versus indigenous values that teach us that we all have obligations. Obligations to the past, present, and future. Obligations to each other. Obligations to our communities. You see, Western values, and I don't mean anything bad by this, but Western values tend to be scientific and skeptical, often requiring proof as a basis for belief. Indigenous worldviews are based on a spiritually orientated society. This is a system based on a belief in the spirit world. To native, lands, water are spiritual. Western worldviews say that there is only one truth based on science or law. Indigenous worldviews say that there can be many truths. Truths are dependent upon individual experiences. Western worldviews has a way of compartmentalizing. Indigenous worldviews say that societies operate in a state of relatedness. Everything and everyone are related. Identity comes from connections. Western worldviews say that the land and water and its resources should be available for development and extraction. Indigenous worldviews believe that the land and water is sacred and is only given to us by our Creator to be carefully and lovingly maintained. Western worldviews judge your success by how well you achieve your goals. Indigenous worldviews judge your success by the quality of your relationships. Western worldviews say that human beings are the most important thing in the world. Indigenous worldviews say that human beings are not the most important thing in the world. And Western worldviews teach that amassing wealth should be done for personal gain. Indigenous worldviews say that amassing wealth may be important, but only in the good for the community as a whole. Do you know the Iroquois Nation? Their leadership doesn't make any decisions without considering what effect that decision would have on 7 generations ahead. Think about the implications for the future if our leaders govern that way. There's an old Native American proverb that says, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." What kind of world are we leaving them? What will their world look like? A scientist once said, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change." He then went on to say, "I thought with 30 good years of science, we could address those problems and solve it." And then he said this, "But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. But we've got to start making decisions that is going to allow our environments to heal. What should those policies look like? You know better than I do. We can start with promoting regenerative agricultural practices. I live in Logan, near Utah State University, and I know many wonderful things are being done there to improve the health of the soil and health of the environment. We can be involved in organizing land restoration projects that build resiliency to drought, restoring beaver habitat, slowing the water, spreading it out, is a wonderful way. The restoration work we're doing at Bear River is a good example of what we can do, and it can serve as a model around the country. We are using our water rights to restore Beaver Creek and the riparian areas along the Bear River, which will put more water back into the Bear River. Proposed legislation, and I cannot wait for tomorrow to get here fast enough, is a start, but we need to keep up the political pressure to get other legislation across the line. It seems they're willing to take baby steps for a problem that is going to require leaps and bounds. The elephant in the room, however, is climate change. Where's that going to go? We must increase political pressure for climate legislation to start reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We've got to come to terms with our culture of consumption, extraction, and depletion. Can this be done? Absolutely. This past October, I had the opportunity to give a lecture in Copenhagen, Denmark. I gave an Indigenous perspective to climate and environment. I think they liked it. They entertained me for 8 days and nights. All 8 days, a different professor would take me out with 10 of their grad students. And those sessions went well into the evening. What I got out of those sessions, however, was that those people live an Indigenous lifestyle. They take less for the sake of the health and the well-being of the community as a whole. They live sustainably. Their water and air are clean. They bike and walk everywhere. They will be carbon neutral by 2025 as a country. I asked them why they're voted the happiest people in the world. And one girl said, well, we have free health care. We have a home to rest our head, and we all have jobs. Our air is clean, our water is clean. Why wouldn't we be happy? We need to start changing our thinking a little bit and consider the health of not only the people, but the health of our watersheds that nourish our lakes and rivers, and the health of our non-human kinfolk. The health of the people will always parallel the health of the water and environment. You see, scientists are finally discovering what Indigenous elders have been teaching forever, that all things are connected. Politicians are discovering what the Iroquois already knew, that we must govern for the future generations. That's what young climate activists are demanding when they demand climate justice. We cannot sacrifice our future for the sake of short-term profits and gains. Remember this quote, "There's not enough science in the world that will overcome our selfish behaviors." One day a hunter brought home a sizable kill, far too much to be eaten by his family. A mountain man nearby said to the hunter, "How are you going to store the excess?" Because drying and storing technologies was well known at the time. The hunter seemed puzzled, and he looked at the mountain man and said, "Store the meat, why would I do that?" Instead, the hunter sent out an invitation for the whole village to come together to join him in a great feast. At the conclusion of the evening, after they had danced and sang around the fire, and they all went home with full bellies, the mountain man was really bothered now, and he again said to the hunter, "Given the uncertainty of fresh meat in the forest, it would have been smarter for you to save and store the excess for your own family, for future use." The hunter looked at him again, and he said, "Store the meat? I store the meat in the belly of my brother. as we become successful by today's standards. I hope that our status in this life will not be determined by how much money we've made, but by how much we do in our communities, and how much we give away, and how much we serve. Here's the problem. We know what the problem is. We know what to do. We know the drivers of climate change. We know all of these things, but we still fail to act. We fail to act because we haven't incorporated values and knowledge together. Now is the time to braid Indigenous and scientific knowledge that will allow us to manage our environment in ways that are going to allow us to achieve our goals and also support Indigenous sovereignty. There are a growing number of case studies around the country right now where a number of Indian tribes are operationalizing this knowledge building and leading restoration efforts. Tribes are finally leading out across this country and showing us how. But when we assume scientific knowledge is superior in any way to Indigenous wisdom, I believe it makes collaboration impossible. And that is what it's going to take in the next few years. I believe we're in the midst of a massive paradigm shift, but now is the time to braid together this Indigenous wisdom and values with cutting-edge biophysical science that will allow us to create these institutions and policies that will allow us to steward our water and environment and climate for future generations. The world as we know it has ended for many things, many times. But in this era, this time, this now, I believe is a never known time before to investigate, to listen, and to invent, and not because we have all the answers, not because we know the way, but precisely because we don't. I don't know how to fix this problem alone, but I believe that abundance sprouts up in strangely improbable places. And what I do know is that I will keep fighting alongside you for many foreseeable years, and I hope you two will too. There's a certain poppy that gets its germination cues from smoke. After the devastating wildfires in 2019 in California, the hills that were turned to black ashes were now lined with these beautiful golden poppies. Similarly, we were all born to bloom, not in spite of the fire in our lives, but because of the fire. Our Creator needs people on fire. Let me close with my favorite guy, Chief Crazy Horse. Right before Chief Crazy Horse died, he had a dream. A translator wrote it down for him, and he said this, and I believe he could see our day and time. He said, upon suffering beyond suffering, the red nations shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing to this sick world. A world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separations. A world that is longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all of the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. In that day, there will be those among my native people who will carry this knowledge and understanding of unity among all living things. And the young white ones will come to those of my people and ask for this wisdom. I salute the light in your eyes where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at the center within you, and I am in that place within me, we shall all live as one. I think the words of Crazy Horse were prophetic, like many Native American leaders who went before. And in what I believe, many will come again. We carry this light. Let us and allow us to share it with you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that was unexpected. I thought I'd get booed out of here after all the science and being the only one without a PowerPoint. We're storytellers. I don't want you looking at some slides I made.
This was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And as you obviously saw, not an easy talk to ask questions after.
I've got a question for you.
Perfect.
That I asked myself. I was in Vail, Colorado the other night I gave a talk on climate. They're kind of like a really active community in that respect. And so I'm driving alone across that road that cuts across Utah. And I had a thought, because I've been pretty active on Twitter when the governor makes these new commissions and stuff, saying all these stakeholders that are on this boards and things. I made a comment in Twitter, one, because my family's not on Twitter, and I can be way more controversial on Twitter. I can say what I feel like saying. I said, you know who's not invited to the table? You don't have any Indigenous people on the boards. And I had a thought driving across the state. What if I do get invited to the table? And they're all going to look at me and say, well, you've been making all the noise. Where's the silver bullet? How are you going to solve this by being on this board with us? And for like 2 miles, I panicked. Like, what's the answer? But I think I kind of mentioned the answer. The answer is not, you know the science. I can't provide science. But I can provide you with a way to re-examine what that scientist said. I can't solve selfishness, apathy, and greed. What I can offer is to frame this in a way that you start listening here and not here. That's the people. Today's been wonderful for me, but people will always forget facts and figures about history, science, anything they see. You will never forget how you felt when you hear a story. Ever. And it doesn't matter how long. And it's those values. It's looking at the world differently, individually, that is going to solve the problem we're in. I know we always ask ourselves, what can I do? I mean, really, how much of a difference can I make? But collectively, we can make a big difference, but we've got to be converted here and not here. And so, I don't know. I'm still really worried about that. I hope he doesn't call. But
There is a question about perhaps telling more of a story about the plans and what happened in the story you told partway through your talk about the Bear River.
We're actually,
getting more water into
yeah,
the
we
Bear
bought
River.
almost 700 acres now. We purchased more. My goal, when I was chairman at the time, I stepped down from being chairman to run for Congress. Shoot me for that decision. I ran on the wrong party, obviously, in Utah. But I wanted to build an interpretive center to tell the story of the people. But my grandmother called our plants and animals our kinfolk. I grew up thinking the plants and animals had as much rights as my cousin. I just treated them differently. And so I couldn't tell the story of the people without having an idea of how can we restore this landscape. I'm looking at this beautiful landscape where the bodies are still lying today. And it's covered with Russian olives and other invasive things that are just not very good that the pioneers brought in for, erosion and things like that. So I just thought, no, we need to tell the story of the land too. And that's why I went to Utah State. We've received over $7 million in land restoration funds. We have taken out most of the Russian olives, and we're working hard every day. We're working with partners, Nature Conservancy, BioWest, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, to all the science that knows how to do these things, to reroute that stream back out where it went, clean up that watershed. Utah State has been invaluable, oh my gosh, helping us accomplish our goals. But we're developing a trail system this spring with an amphitheater. The building will get built whenever I raise the rest of the money for it. I had a really good start on it, but that COVID kind of shut that down. And building costs have gone crazy. You know how building costs have gone. So I thought I was getting close to it, but I'm not as close as I thought. But we'll build the building when we can get funding for the building. The LDS Church made their first donation for it, as they should have. And it was significant. The state of Utah gave us an appropriation a couple of years ago for a building in Idaho. Think about that one. So I'm not dogging them all the way, but we've developed partnerships with people that just do their thing and we just get out of their way and let them do it. But it's a wonderful project, and if you ever want to go up there, let me know and I'll give you a private tour of a sacred place. So, hi, Bonnie.
Right? And include those perspectives, it's really hard to find sources. And as a scholar, I'm a scholar, I wonder if that is challenging for you to bring those oral history issues and to students. And how can you amplify oral histories of urban internet?
For those on the internet, the question is about the ways in which you can bring oral stories and the difficulties of doing that rather than written stories.
I'll answer that really quickly because time's over, and so maybe I won't even answer it. But I went to a conference, the Western History Association conference, and presented a few years ago in San Antonio. And I mentioned I wrote this book called The Bear of Massacre, Shoshone History. It's only written from oral history and accounts from my grandmother. Well, she wrote it down. So she'd gone to boarding school. She became educated. She started writing down all of the oral history that she'd heard as a child. So our tribe has tons and volumes of history now written down, so you can, and it's housed at Utah State in special collections. And so you can go on there and get anything you need from us today. But that oral history, well, so back to this conference, I mentioned that I did that, and a professor from TCU, she stood up and she said, well, I hope you use primary sources. And if I could have come across the table fast enough, I just said, bless you, young lady. But one thing people don't understand about oral history is I sat at the feet of a grandmother and heard these stories word for word for years. And it was word for word. And if I ever looked tired or anything, she would stop because it was important that I got every word right. And so that oral history is still important. And I think in academia today, it's becoming not such a problem. I think it's being recognized for what it is. All you white people out there, I mean, you tell a story and 2 things down, it's a different story. Oral history wasn't like that, though. Storytelling wasn't like that. And so I understand why you're skeptical with it, but hang with us. And my book is, it's like storytelling. You're not going to get sources and other things in that, and it's just a different way, but that's something we struggle with all the time. And I don't know, I don't have a good answer for it, but from a Native perspective, that oral history is as gold. It's as accurate as anything else. And let me just say this about primary sources. Isn't it somebody's perspective that they wrote down 150 years ago? What biases did they have? Brigham Young was kind of a racist. He was. Hell, I'm LDS. So, but all of your factors in life lead you to having a certain bias. And so when they write down in their journals that this happened, now we call it gold today. That's the gold standard of we have this written history. Well, yeah, but it comes with baggage. And so I don't think it's any more accurate than anything else. It's just how we look at it. So thanks for the question, though. And I don't want to cut into your time. So thanks for having me.
I'm asked to remind everyone that the break will end promptly at 2:40. And I hope we'll all continue on the journey together.